You're listening to Have the Nerve, a podcast about disability. I'm your host, Susan Wood, and for this episode, I talk to Western Australia Greens Senator Jordon Steele-John, who was elected to the Australian Senate in 2017 at the age of 23, making him the youngest sitting member in Australian Parliament and the youngest senator. Jordon and I talk about his first days at Parliament House as a person with a disability and why diversity is so important in politics. This episode was recorded as a video, so if you'd like to watch this interview as well as hearing the entire episode of this podcast, head over to our YouTube page and have a look. So, Senator Jordon Steele-John, thank you very much for joining me today.
Wonderful to be here.
Just to start, you were elected in 2017 and you were the youngest senator elected. Do you just want to talk through why you chose to be a representative?
Well, in some ways, Susan, it kind of chose me. I'm lucky enough to come from a wonderful family that was very social justice focused. My mum was a social worker in the UK for child protection social worker for 20 or so years. And so social justice and the impact of the systems that have been created, to support people not working properly was something that, I was very aware of, even from a very young age, combined with care about issues like climate change and protecting and preserving the planet. So all of the seeds of growing into a green, if you like, were planted with me from a very early age. But what I have always been most interested in is people and working with people to organize, to activate the power of collective action, particularly at the grassroots level. So I loved as a kid attending protests and rallies and listening to people kind of disrupt the political system and learning about strikes and the women's movement and the Black liberation movement and all of these wonderful examples through history of people coming together to push against oppression and for equality and justice. So I thought I would get involved probably in social work, and that was what I was going to do, or teaching or something like that. And I think in my teenage years, I kind of really began to see that so many of the connections between the problems that exist in our communities and the challenges that we face as disabled people lead back to decisions that are made by people in decision-making spaces called parliaments. And I was like, well, actually, seems like we need more people with lived experience in those spaces that actually want to make change together with the community. So that's what kind of led me to thinking politics was a good idea, or where I wanted to put energy. And then in terms of how I actually got elected, that's a whole nother story in itself.
Let's talk about, just very briefly, your first day in Parliament at Parliament House. Maybe there could be some people out there that don't remember or didn't really hear about it at the time, but do you want to talk about your first day at Parliament House and accessibility?
Yeah, absolutely, Susan. So it was not good. It was not good, very bad. Was what we discovered. There'd never been a disabled person that used a wheelchair elected to the Senate, and so they had made no accommodations for it. They didn't even have a desk for me to be able to sit at, to be able to sit at in the chamber. So none of that was a thing, and so they had to improvise it. And unfortunately, they improvised it pretty slowly. So it took about 7 months until I had a functional office. We were just about to get the desk done. We were able to modify the desk on the night before Parliament started, thanks to the wonderful work of the carpentry team at Parliament House. But the doors of every doorway into every office was too narrow. Or the were too heavy to open, or there was no accessible loo or anything. So I did my first press conference with blood running down the back of my hand, because just as I rolled out into the courtyard, I clipped it on a door frame. So, it was really bad. And what it did for me is it just reminded me of the assumptions that had been in that place for so long, that a disabled person just wasn't meant to occupy these spaces, wasn't who was accounted for. And ever since then, I've been really passionate about bringing, not only, continuing the work of bringing more disabled people in decision-making spaces, which is something I've always had with me, but upon discovering how inaccessible the Parliament is, my vibe is like, we got to get that fixed. Because if the space that creates the laws that shape our lives is physically inaccessible, doesn't have disabled people in it, then we will continue to have decisions made in that place that completely erase us, don't take us into account, and make ableism worse.
Was there a conversation with you previous to you coming to Canberra about accessibility, what your needs are, anything like that before you actually arrived?
There were a couple of urgent conversations with key people in Parliament House, definitely. And unfortunately, because they'd never planned for it, it was very reactive. Like, oh my God, we don't even have a desk. How are we going to sort this out? Oh my God, there's not an office. How are we going to build one? And then as it got less and less immediate, if you like, the work slowed down. And that's something we often find as disabled people, that they'll put out the immediate fire, but the broader thing, if you fight, they'll put out the fire. The work of like preventing the fire starting again is harder to get people to engage with. But I've got a meeting set up with the head of Department of Parliamentary Services, and one of our other Greens MPs, Nick McKim, has been a fabulous ally to me as our whip, part of our leadership team. So he's coming with me to that meeting to crack the whip on the next version of the Access Inclusion Plan for the Parliament, and to get some of this basic stuff really speeded up now that we have collectively yeeted Scott Morrison into the sun.
As you said earlier, you're not the only person with a disability in Parliament, not the only person with a disability on a state or federal level. And like you said earlier, diversity of representation is incredibly important, especially when it comes to actually representing the people.
Well, I think, Susan, at the moment that I actually may be still the only person at that federal level, at the national level, that openly describes themselves as a disabled person that we know of. There could well be people with invisible disabilities in the Parliament, or people that for one reason or another don't feel comfortable identifying in that way. But as far as like disabled people that are like, yep, I'm disabled, I think I'm the only one at the moment. There's others at state level, and there's disabled councillors, but at the federal level, it's just me at the moment. And it's really important that change. Like, it's really important that we have all the different types of diversity present in our community, present in our Parliament, because the key to a representative democracy, the key word there is representative. And at the moment, even with the higher levels of diversity that exist within this new Parliament, there's far too many older white blokes still in positions of power. So I think what we need to do really urgently is get more disabled people involved, which means continuing to drive ableism out of our culture so that disabled people are not immediately dismissed, making place and space accessible, and then making the platforms for discourse accessible. Parliament isn't Auslan interpreted. Like, if you're a deaf person, there's no way to access the content of anything to do with a parliamentary debate through an Auslan interpreter. So that's ridiculous, for instance. So all of those things have got to change. We need more disabled people in that space, because these are the spaces where the NDIS is changed, expanded, fixed. These are the spaces where the DSP and its levels are debated. But these are also the spaces where all of the other issues that affect us as disabled people are decided. And we are holistic human beings. So, yeah, need more disabled people in there, need more young people in there, need more young women in there, and people of colour too.
You brought up the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or the NDIS, for people who aren't really aware of what that is if they're outside of Australia, yes. And the Disability Support Pension, the DSP. And it kind of seems to me that the lack of representation of people with disabilities in Parliament, and the continually talk about the NDIS and the issues going on with the NDIS might seem like the only thing that people with disabilities want to talk about is the NDIS and the disability support pension and maybe one other thing.
Don't forget accessible toilets. Don't forget accessible toilets.
Bathrooms.
We love talking about, the Paralympics. Yeah.
Yeah,
because we're all going to be Paralympians. That's the solution, Susan. We all go in the Paralympics. And like the Paralympics is fantastic, but the point is, we are a diverse community, right? We can like all different kinds of things.
If we've only got very few representations of people with disabilities and we only talk about certain things, people might think that that's the only thing that we're discussing, but that's not true. Things that affect people with disabilities actually filter into every facet of society. Do you want to give some examples of like things that you've legislatively we haven't really addressed for people with disabilities?
Absolutely. So basically every area of policy, right? There's a disability lens, there's a disability angle, because ableism, discrimination against disabled people, infects every part of our society, right? So in the housing space, for instance, disabled people find it incredibly difficult to find and access public or affordable housing. Public housing stock is overwhelmingly inaccessible to us as disabled people, and general housing stock is overwhelmingly unaffordable. So that's one issue right there. There's solutions to that. We can have nationally consistent access and inclusion guidelines in housing design. We can reduce the cost of public housing. We can cap rents so that disabled people can afford to live in somewhere that is close to where they might be able to get a job, for instance, or on a train line. Wow. So we can do those kind of things in the housing space. In the employment space, we've got a historically high level of disability unemployment. And there's lots we can do about that, from holding employers accountable for discrimination through to implementing proper quotas and targets in the public service, so that we aim to employ about 20% of our public service workforce from the disability community. In the education space, still 15 to 20% of disabled kids are educated in segregated settings, even though we know that special schools and special ed units, whatever you want to call them, produce terrible academic outcomes for kids. They create segregated dynamics that are not really healthy at all. And then there's some great examples of how to do education inclusively, and that we need to be planning to achieve that. But at the moment, the federal government, state governments are like, segregated education is fine. So there's work to do in those spaces too. And then in a space that we often don't talk about because it's a bit, taboo, but actually the intersection of disability and sexuality is a really important one. And then acknowledging that as disabled people, we do have a right to sexual expression, and that needs to be supported in policy settings around the NDIS, but also needs to be supported through really holistic sex education presented to children and young adults, to the entire educational spectrum, so that we get rid of this idea of disabled people as non-sexual beings, and also give people access to information about their bodies, about healthy relationships, without an assumption that because you might have an intellectual disability or a physical disability or a neurodivergence, you either wouldn't be interested in or shouldn't be given access to that information.
And there's also a very new concept around disability pride. I feel like it's new. I don't know about yourself, but I feel like it's new.
Oh, it's very new to Australia. Very new to Australia.
Yeah, very new to Australia, and we're still trying to, like, I guess, promote it in a way. And so when we're not represented in all facets of society, it's really hard to get the point across around disability pride and being proud about your disability. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think disability pride is critical, right? And a lot of people haven't, some people still in Australia haven't heard of it. It's a newer concept to our community. But basically, you boil it down, disability pride is about recognizing that we as disabled people, regardless of our impairments or support needs, are members of a broader community in our nation, 4 million strong, people that are the subject of discrimination, are the subject of exclusion, and in the face of that discrimination and exclusion, are working collectively, not only to end it, but also to innovate, to connect, to create, and to work together in ways that we can be incredibly proud of, just as women, just as queer folks, just as people of color are subject to extraordinary discrimination, and have always and will always fight against that. And for that fight should be recognized and supported, but also in their own right are the custodians and creators of incredibly valuable culture and peer support. And that's really the same for our community. What disability pride is all about is celebrating who we are as disabled people, both in the face of the discrimination that we experience and also acknowledging the contribution that we make to our communities and to our broader, like, Australian project, if you like, as problematic as the idea of an Australian project can be. It's certainly not about loving everything about being disabled all the time, because there's always going to be a moment when you're like, oh, I understand that I'm experiencing this because of systemic racism, but it's still shit, you know, and I still wish I didn't have to do it. But it is about, in that moment, feeling that pain and knowing that you aren't alone in it, and knowing that ultimately you are not the reason for it. The reason for it is the barriers in society, and that we can break them down together, and that as disabled people, we not only matter, we are good and should be celebrated and recognized.
And it's about, I guess, laying the path for the next generation of people with disabilities and the children who also grow up with disabilities who may not have that representation, or, I guess, may not have the representation that, well, I didn't. Did you?
No, no, I think I had it in some places, but not really until I was a teenager. Did I have that kind of, did I meet other disabled people who were proudly and boldly disabled, you know? And really, really are the equivalents of those proud, out, strong, staunch queer members of the queer community, members of the Black community that pioneered that same idea of, like, let's move the conversation on from justice to the, like in the American vernacular, the conversation went from, like, let's include and give justice to Black people, through to actually Black power, Black pride, Black beauty, was the shift that was made probably in the 70s, really, onwards for the African American community. And that's where we're moving to now as a disability community, with the help of disability pride, is a concept of pride, power, and yes, beauty as well, and celebration.
So, Jordon, what are you working on at the moment for people with disabilities, or just as a whole? What are you working on at the moment?
Well, it's God, that's a big question, Susan. I'll try and keep it brief. But we've just had the first sitting of the Parliament, the new Parliament. There's a new energy and a new spirit to want to collaborate and get things done. One of our focuses as the disability rights spokesperson for the Greens is to fix the NDIS and to ensure that disabled people are promoted into positions of leadership on the board as chair, in the CEO position, within the broader agency, so that disabled people lead the work of fixing the NDIS, returning the cut money to the plans, restoring the support hours, ending the terrible cases at the AAT and all of the other work that needs to be done to end the exclusion of older people and to ensure particularly that neurodiverse people and people with psychosocial disabilities are not discriminated against when they access the NDIS. So all of that work remains to be done, plus the work we need to do to fix the disability employment system, make sure that healthcare works for disabled people properly, and so does the education system, but also beyond even that work. I'm also the portfolio holder for the Greens for health and mental health, including bringing mental and dental care into Medicare, which is something we're going to be continuing to work on. And I'm also the Greens spokesperson for foreign affairs, peace and disarmament. So there's going to be a lot of work over the next 3 years in how do we de-escalate tensions globally? How do we, as a country, develop a peaceful and independent foreign policy? How do we make sure that we rid the world of things like nuclear weapons and ensure that we don't attain that capacity here? And also, how do we work to expand Medicare more broadly so that you actually can get, for instance, an autism diagnosis or an ADHD diagnosis without shelling out, $2,000, $3,000, $5,000. So there's a lot of work to do, but I'm really excited about what we can achieve together.
So we've got people, we want more disability representation in Parliament. We want more disability representation everywhere. How do we encourage our able-bodied allies to get on board to take disability issues seriously? Because as far as I'm concerned or have noticed, we're pretty much the only ones talking about it at the moment. So how do we encourage them?
Here's a really good first step for allies listening today. The best thing you can do, or one of the best things you can do, is get clear on what disability is. Okay, and move the mindset from a conception of disability, which you may have as an ally, as something that is inherently tied to the person. So, Jordon can't walk. Jordon can't, go up a flight of stairs, blah, 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 to something that is, that's to a mindset that sees disability as primarily a social construct. So understanding that I might not be able to walk, for instance, but whether or not I can get into a venue, if there's only a flight of stairs, is actually decided by whether or not anybody thought to fit a lift, or whether an autistic person is able to engage in a conversation or a format in relation to, contributing to an art space, for instance, is dependent on whether anybody thought to allow space for a quiet room. If they need some time to defrag. Whether somebody that is blind or visually impaired is able to participate in their space is not to do with whether or not they're blind. It's to do with, did anybody actually think of making this an accessible space for somebody that needs a screen reader, for instance, or for a deaf person who booked the Auslan interpreter, And what we do when we do that, what allies do as they shift their mindset to that place, suddenly then we can see that disability, the barriers associated with it, the negatives associated with disability, are a product of decisions made by the collective community. They're created by the ableism in those decisions, ableism which we can all challenge together. So by being guided by a disabled person to be like, hey, can you just check if the venue is accessible, and actually if it isn't, maybe don't use that venue, like that, in the same way that men and white people have a critical role to play in deconstructing misogyny and systemic racism, so too do non-disabled folks in ending ableism.
All right, Senator, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Susan. Lovely to chat.
You've been listening to Have the Nerve, a podcast that has been written, produced and edited by me, Susan Wood, and logo art by Kobe and more. This podcast has been funded by the Australian Department of Social Services as part of our resource hub. We want to empower people with disabilities, their friends, carers, research students, anyone just about disability. You can check it out by clicking the show notes in this podcast or head over to scia.org.au. Once again, don't forget to give us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave us a comment, and maybe reconnect with someone you haven't spoken to for a while and blatantly promote this podcast on my behalf. Go on. Thanks for listening.